Good morning. Can I welcome members to the 26th meeting of the Education and Culture Committee in 2012. Can I remind all members and those in the public gallery to ensure that all electronic devices are switched off at all times. Our first item is our final evidence session on the Scottish Government's draft budget 2013-2014. The Cabinet Secretary for Education and Lifelong Learning is here until 10 o'clock, at which point we will take evidence from the Cabinet Secretary for Culture and External Affairs. As we have some limited time this morning, can I ask members and the Cabinet Secretary to keep their questions and answers brief and focused, if at all possible. Can I welcome to the committee Michael Russell, Cabinet Secretary for Education and Lifelong Learning, Andrew Scott, Director of Employability, Skills and Lifelong Learning, Sarah Smith, Director of Learning, and Mike Fowlis, Director of Children and Families, all from the Scottish Government. Good morning, Cabinet Secretary, and can I invite you to make an opening statement?
I shall make a brief and focused opening statement. I'm grateful for the opportunity to discuss the draft budget and to talk to the committee about the progress that's been made within my portfolio over the last year. My recent letter, I hope, will have provided you with clear answers to your specific questions on our spending plan, particularly relating to colleges and how we're supporting climate change issues. I'll be happy to answer questions on that, of course, as well. Let me start with the early years. Taken as a whole, our draft budget invests heavily in our children and young people and supports our ambition to make Scotland the best place to grow up. The budget includes scope for us to continue to prioritise the early years. Among other investments, it provides £50 million towards an overall £270 million Early Years Change Fund, which includes £18 million for family support and a new £20 million fund supporting third sector organisations working with children and families. All are significant investments in helping us to get right from the very start for every child in Scotland. Through Curriculum for Excellence, children are now learning differently and better, and the modern schools we are building underpin that. This budget enables us to continue to support the implementation of this programme by contributing to the £1.25 billion we've provided for the construction of 67 new or refurbished schools by March 2018. That's 12 more schools than we originally planned. The additional investment will benefit over 69,000 pupils. The committee has rightly recognised that our post-16 reforms are ambitious, and I welcome the particular focus you've given to colleges. I want to get this position perfectly clear. The priority is for young people to have the right learning in the right place to achieve the qualifications and experiences needed to secure good jobs. At the heart of our reform programme is an impetus to better focus post-16 education on the needs of learners and employers, not institutions. Our key policy objectives are to improve life chances, support jobs and growth, and ensure the sustainability of the system. I'm very encouraged that the first round of college outcome agreements sets out real progress towards these objectives, with key achievements on maintaining student numbers, mergers and federations, and regional planning. Colleges themselves are welcoming the changes and are more than ready for the challenge, and we're supporting them. Indeed, let me underline what I would regard as an unshakable commitment to colleges. This government's investment in further education since 2007 will exceed £5 billion by 2015. That's 40% more in cash terms than the investment made under the two terms of the previous administration, a massive increase by any measure. Through our budget, funding has risen from last year's planned budget to a total of £546 million this year. This will assure that, yet again, the volume of college learning is maintained. We've listened carefully to the arguments put forward, so our draft budget allocates an additional £17 million to colleges for 13-14 relative to the spending review proposals of last year, so that as well as maintaining the volume of learning, student support can continue at record levels. I'm not going to shy away from the fact that by the end of the spending review period, we'll be putting less revenue support into colleges. That's been a difficult decision, but it's the right one. The reforms will deliver more with less. They're already doing so, and that's to the credit of our college leaders. We're also supporting, through the non-profit distributing model, the construction of exciting new college buildings in Glasgow, Inverness and Kilmarnock, an investment of some £300 million. We want to ensure that all of Scotland's young people get the best chance to fulfil their potential. That's why we'll continue to deliver record levels of funding to universities, to keep higher education free and to protect places. That's why we're providing £30 million to support the youth employment strategy, with funding for local authorities in the third sector. It's also why we're maintaining our pledge to support 25,000 apprenticeship starts in each year of this Parliament as part of our commitment to offer every 16 to 19-year-old a place of learning and training. That is, as you know, Convener, the first guarantee of its type anywhere in these islands. And already in colleges all over Scotland, thousands of young people have taken up a place or are in the process of doing so. Moreover, there are still places available in courses that will benefit our economy. Along with other budgets in Scotland, of course, ours bears the marks of having been savagely cut by the UK government. However, we are making every penny count by investing in the future of our young people. There is, I believe, nowhere else in the UK that can match our record. We're prioritising spend in the early years. We have a unique school curriculum fit for the future and a university sector still based on the principle of free education. We also have a college sector undergoing radical but well-founded reforms, progressive reforms, that will bring benefits for many years to come. I'm happy to take questions.
Can I thank on behalf of the committee you for that opening statement, Cabinet Secretary. Can I begin with a question, a general question on some of the evidence we've received? I think it's fair to say that many of us felt that the evidence was somewhat confusing in terms of the transparency of the budget process and the ability of the committee to then, if you like, delve down below the surface figures to try and get an understanding of what actually was happening in the budget year on year, whether that be part of the problem, of course, being the difference between academic and financial year, but also just the difficulty even of some of our witnesses, many of them experts in their field, all being able to try and explain to us what was happening year on year. Do you think, or do you agree with me that the budget process that the government puts forward could be much more transparent than it currently is?
I think in terms of education, there are complex issues which need simplified. I wouldn't necessarily, convener, say that the evidence the government is putting forward needs clarified. I think the processes by which funding takes place sometimes need clarified. An example I would use is college funding. College funding is a very, very complex thing. There are, I think, 2.1 million weighted sums, roughly. Now, I'd be happy to debate the issue of weighted sums with this committee all day, but we wouldn't be any the wiser at the end of it. One of the persistent views I have taken since I became Education Secretary is to seek clarification and simplification of the process of funding. And indeed, it's been a constant theme in my discussions with all the sectors that I work with. The outcome agreement process, both for colleges and universities, will, I hope, year on year, make things in higher and further education much, much clearer. It will provide both a map of what is taking place. It will provide also a definition of what is being done for the resource provided. I hope that will help. The issue of school education is complex too because it goes through a middleman, so to speak. It goes to local authorities who deliver. And further clarity in that would be desirable for all of us. And indeed, as you will know, that's been a perpetual theme of this committee since it was established, trying to get to the bottom of exactly what happens to that money. I'm very keen that we are as clear and, as we possibly can be, not just for the process of budget scrutiny, though that's exceptionally important, but for the wider process of people understanding what public money pays for in education and how it's delivered.
Thank you for that. Liz Smith.
Good morning, Cabinet Secretary. Notwithstanding your answer there to the convener, would you accept that for Parliament and for committee to scrutinise the budget effectively, we have to be clear about what the figures mean, about their transparency, and be able to compare like for like? Would you accept that that is the budget process?
I would certainly accept that, and that's what I think myself, my officials, my colleagues in government will always strive to help the committee to do.
We've had quite a considerable amount of evidence put to us this time that that has not been the case. We've had Jeremy Peat, we've had Mark Batho, we've had various principals within colleges, and we've had Audit Scotland making the claim that there has been a lack of transparency and a lack of ability for us to be able to look at what the real figures happen to be. And that has been a very difficult process for all of us because we feel that, notwithstanding the fact that obviously there are complexities which you've referred to about the academic year not being the same as the financial year, but on top of that, the criticism that we're getting is that we haven't had sufficient detail of the level 4 statistics. And I wonder if you could comment on why it is that we've not had, why have you not been in a position to give us the level 4 detail?
I think we've given you and continue to give you very substantial amounts of information. And I'm very open to discussion with you, with the committee, with individuals who are interested in education and your role as the spokesperson on any of the detail that you would wish to discuss. And indeed, I would want to make sure that there was a transparent understanding. I have to say that one of the problems is sometimes figures are misrepresented, sometimes by opposition spokespeople, as being things that they are not. It is important that everybody understands the relationship between the funding provided and what takes place. And that's why I go back to it. The outcome agreement process, I think, is a major step forward. If that is allied to these figures, and the outcome agreements are being published, if that is allied to these figures, and also to a simpler system of funding colleges, which I am very keen to see put in place, and indeed is in the process of being put in place, and a simpler college structure, and I'm simply using college as an example, because that's, I think, been the area where most of the debate has been, I think the possibility exists for much clearer understanding. The Audit Scotland report is very helpful. I think the arguments it puts about the need for a strategic view, I entirely accept, and where it is possible for us to provide further information that helps the debate, we will always do so. For example, in the letter that the committee has had that clarifies some of the figures which you asked about, and I'm entirely open to clarify those too.
So, to ask for that clarification, and there are other areas of the Scottish budget where the level 4 figures have actually been available. But
I think we've provided everything that has been asked for, and if more is asked for, we will consider providing it in the most helpful way. I think sometimes people who say you're not giving us the information are actually saying we don't like the information you've got. The information is here, is being provided, and I am open to discussion. If you would like to ask in detail about any of the figures listed here, we'll answer it.
Well, I'll come back to that in just a minute, but can I go on this point again, please, because I think it's very important that the level 4 figures that we have not had are actually very important. And actually, dare I say, I think they're quite important to the Scottish Government's cause of explaining what the overarching strategy is and how you expect these figures to be disseminated. Now, we've not had that information, and Audit Scotland has criticised you for that.
No, I don't think they have. I mean, you have had level 4 figures provided to you.
Well, forgive me for saying so, but I don't think we have had. We had evidence provided by Mark Batho as well that he was unaware of some of the transfer that was taking place between the Scottish Funding Council and what was going to be a ring-fenced. He'd only heard that when he'd attended a Scottish Colleges meeting.
I'm happy to look at what Mark Batho said and to clarify it if it is necessary to clarify it. Well, you'd have to put that to me, but we have provided level 4 figures to you. That information is available to you. I'm open to question about it. It might be more productive, if I might suggest, to question line by line or item by item, rather than to complain about what doesn't exist where I believe it does exist.
My final question then, Cabinet Secretary, would you accept what Audit Scotland has said in their report, that the Scottish Government revenue grant support to colleges is likely to fall from 545 million in 2011-12 to 471 million in 2014-15. This represents a reduction of 24% in real terms. Is that correct?
I'm happy to clarify that figure, and now we're on to a substantive figure. This is a complex process, and I'm sorry that you can't, it's impossible to talk about figures without talking in some detail. The complexity is part of the process. There has been additional investment in the spending review period so far, because what Audit Scotland is rightly quoting the spending review figures, but not quoting the additional £67.5 million that has gone into the college system so far, and we're in the second, or coming into the second year of a 3-year spending review period. Obviously, I can make no commitment for the final year, but for example, the budget for colleges in the coming year will be 511 million, not the figure that was originally proposed in the spending review. So additional sums have been added in. Now, this is not news. I said this at this committee last year, I think. I've said it repeatedly when I've been questioned on it. There has been, I think, since I became minister, in-year adjustments to college figures because we are involved in a complex, detailed series of reforms, and we debate and discuss what is required. For example, the 15 million transformation fund was added in and is not in those figures. The 17 million pounds added in both for student support and places in the budget presently being debated is not in those figures. So the Audit Scotland report is accurate in terms of the published spending review figures, but it's not accurate in terms of the actual figures that are spent.
Right. So if it's not 24%, if you're disagreeing with this comment here...
No, I'm not disagreeing. I'm explaining that there are circumstances which add information which is necessary to understand. Not everything, I have to say, is a straight line. There are things that change during years, and I've just told you that £67.5 million was added in, or is being added in.
I think, Cabinet Secretary, in your first answer to me on that point, you suggested that you didn't agree with that 24%.
Well, if I suggested that, I'm sorry you took that interpretation. I want to be absolutely clear. You asked for clarity.
Well,
£67.5 million is being added in the first 2 years of that spending review period. So while that figure reflects the published spending review, it doesn't reflect the actuality of expenditure. I think that's very clear.
Is this statement on page 3 of the Audit Scotland report, is it correct?
The figure reflects the spending review published figures. It does not reflect the £67.5 million added in. And indeed, we can quantify that £67.5 million detail by detail. £17 million this year, which is places, and Andrew will keep me right on this, £70 million this year on places and student support, £15 million from the Transformation Fund, Andrew?
Yes, that's right.
And the rest?
And £13 million for college, and £6 million for college places this year. £11 million for student support.
Yeah.
Makes
I think it's in the letter that we sent to
Yeah.
you. I think it's in the letter
It's
we
in the
sent to you.
second-
It's quite clear what the figures say. So, it is important to understand the complexity of the issue.
The additions are in the second and the third tables of the letter.
Yeah.
Thank you. Neil Findlay.
I'm sure you would understand why many people who come to this committee have come up with different figures from yourself. Surely there is a serious problem in our accountability to the people who elect us to come here if we cannot explain to them, and expert witnesses who come before this committee cannot explain what the budget is for our colleges.
No, the problem would be if I was sitting here and not able to answer that question. I've just answered that question to Liz Smith. I'm answering it to you now. There is a published spending review which says the college figure will go from that to that to that. Now, as a result of listening to the colleges, as a result of the political debate, I've even heard members of this committee claim as a result of pressures from them, those figures change and money has been added in. I would have thought that that is a matter of actually some satisfaction that we are listening to that, not a matter for complaint. And as providing we are open and transparent about that, and I'm endeavouring to be so, and we can always improve that it's helpful for the Auditor General report to make that point, as long as we are open and transparent about that, which we are being open and transparent. And here are the level 4 figures, which you know about. Then in all those circumstances, I think that's part of the transparency of government and the scrutiny of government.
So, I mean, today we've had the evidence from Audit Scotland, and I've listened to what you've said. We've had the EIS, we've had the UCU, we've had the Unison, we've had Professor Peat, we've had Professor Gallagher, we've had the former chair of Reed Care, all disputing what you're saying. No. So they're all wrong, and you're correct.
No, I've heard you on that tack before, Mr. Findlay. That's not what I'm saying at all.
And I've heard you on your tack
Yes, well,
before.
indeed. Well, therefore, let's try and throw some light on this, right, again. The reality of the situation is you publish a set of figures in a spending review, and that's what is published, and that's what you expect to happen. And then, particularly on the college sector, which has been the subject of very considerable debate and discussion, you listen to the arguments that are taking place, and if it is possible, and we're in very tough financial times, a series of cuts from Westminster, started by Labour, pursued by Liberals and Tories, even in those times, we've been able to find, where it is necessary, some resource to meet demand. The £15 million Transformation Fund is a very important part of that. But within that overall context, too, we know that the process of change in colleges is going to save money. The conservative estimate from, I use that with a small c, the conservative estimate from the Scottish Funding Council is £50 million. So we are making progress also in making this sector fit for purpose. So that's part of the process of change, and it's open and transparent.
Your assertion is that the process regionalisation will make considerable savings. Yet Audit Scotland say that the benefits and costs remain unclear. Do you agree with that, or are they wrong in that also?
No, it's not also, because I've indicated they're not wrong in other things. So please, please don't misquote me. What I'm saying on that is that the Funding Council has indicated an estimate, not me, the Funding Council has indicated an estimate of £50 million, which will be saved. I'm pleased at that. That's what we're trying to do. I think what the Auditor General is saying and the Audit Scotland is saying, and I accept that, is we need to continue to be and to be ever more clear as those benefits emerge. Benefits of merger are estimated when they start, and then work is done to make sure they emerge. If you look at the work that was done in the merger of the Glasgow colleges into the City of Glasgow College, that actually produced greater savings than were expected and greater efficiency than was expected. And remember, the purpose of this too is to focus on the outcomes for young people. And I think that young people will get better outcomes.
I listened to you complain about cuts from Westminster, but previously, and I'm not misquoting here, that you were the person who said that the funding formula from Westminster, the Barnett formula, was killing us with kindness. Surely you now approve of the cuts from Westminster?
Well, Mr. Fidley, I am really delighted that you're such a close study of everything I write. I think I shall send you as a gift everything else I've written. Can I say, I would refer you to page 14 of the book in question. I wish I'd brought it with me, otherwise I would have read it to the record. Page 14 gives you the perfect answer to that point and to all the other points you've raised in terms of what the book is, how it was a debate between individuals, how neither individual necessarily accepted everything within it. But I'm really pleased that you're adding so much to my sales. You are a great advocate of the written word.
Delighted to buy it for 16 pence.
Indeed. Well, it just shows that knowledge doesn't come cheap.
Liam MacArthur.
Thank you, Convener. In relation to the transparency, what's interesting is that the concerns around the confusion, the complexity of the funding appears to have arisen to a far greater extent this year than was the case last year. There were specific concerns, as you will recall. There was some success in moving you in a direction you appeared slightly resistant to at the outset, but nevertheless, that issue of transparency has certainly arisen more in the evidence we've received this year than was the case last year. So whatever the reason for that is, I sort of make that observation. Do you think, though, that it is perhaps not helped by what I think Professor Gallagher called biscuit tin funding, where there's an increasing number of small pots of funding aimed at funding specific initiatives? There was concerns, I think, by the principal of Borders College that what that was delivering, the quality of what it was delivering, whether it was the right type of course in the right way at the right time, was something that certainly she didn't necessarily have a great deal of confidence in. Do you think you're making a difficult situation worse by that approach?
No, I don't, and I don't think there is that approach. I think there is a process of change that is taking place in the funding structure, and it's a necessary process of change. Change is never easy, and in a sector such as the college sector, which was ripe for change and reform, and almost every commentator accepts that, then the process of change can be difficult. But I don't accept that that is the process that's going on. I think if there is any dubiety this year, it may be because we are at a crucial period in that process of change, that there are things that are changing bit by bit. And I think it'll be a lot clearer next year. But I am very keen that people understand with as much clarity as possible what is taking place. That's why these figures are here. That's why I'm happy to talk to individuals or the committee collectively. That's why I'm happy to give access to our officials, to opposition spokespeople and others. It is why I spend a great deal of my time with the college sector, talking with them about what is taking place. It's why I listen to their concerns. And if possible, we make changes. It's why I listen, obviously, keenly to yourself and others and try and change what we're doing if we possibly can do it, and where there is a possibility of making things better or easier. And I do think the in-year changes we made last year, which were difficult to do, particularly in finding resource for it, given the effect of the spending cuts from Liberals and Tories south of the border, even then, we managed to find some money to make it better. I don't deny it's a complex subject, college funding. It's very complex. When I became minister, I asked somebody I knew quite well, who was a college finance director, to come and explain the system of weighted sums to me. And, you know, I must admit it took a very long time before the penny dropped. This is a very complex way of funding anything. That's why I want to change it. And it will change and is changing over a period of time. But within the confines of that and the context of that, I would like to provide as much information as I can.
Moving on from transparency, Neil Bibby.
Thanks, Convener. And I was pleased to hear the Cabinet Secretary said he was happy to provide as much information as he can and to clarify various points that we've heard. Cabinet Secretary, can you confirm, therefore, has there been a headcount reduction of 1,300 staff over the last year alone in colleges?
Well, I would have to look at the figures as published, but there has certainly been a headcount reduction. I don't think there's any doubt of that. I hope it has been achieved as I wish it to be achieved, where it's required by no compulsory redundancies. But of course, my ability to direct colleges in that regard does not exist because it was removed by Alan Wilson when he was the Labour Minister.
Can I ask about, can any of your officials answer the question about the 13, specifically if it's 1,300?
I'll ask Andrew Scott, but if the figures indicate that there's been a headcount reduction of 1,300 and you provide those figures to me, I'm happy to see whether they're true or not. But there will have been. I mean, I will certainly be prepared to say there has been a reduction in staffing. And that reduction in staffing, I hope, has been carried out in a way that has led to no compulsory redundancies.
We've also we've seen I think it's, you know, from all the evidence we've seen, we've seen a reduction in staffing, and obviously we need to look forward to getting more information confirming the exact extent of that. In terms of student numbers, we've also seen a reduction in student numbers according to Scotland's colleges, a headcount figure of 70,000. Can you confirm that's the case?
No, that's a misunderstanding of the figures.
Shouldn't headcount down 70,000?
That is a misunderstanding of the figures. The full-time equivalent has remained...
No, student headcount, student headcount is what I'm asking about, reduction of 70,000. Is that right?
There are 2.1 million weighted sums.
I'm not asking about, I'm asking about student headcount.
Let the Cabinet Secretary, you'll bring you back in, but let the Cabinet Secretary answer, then you can...
There is a full-time equivalent of 116,000. The variety in headcount is between year and changes every year, because the number of full-time as opposed to part-time places, the number of short courses as opposed to longer courses changes. What we have been determined to do, what we're trying very hard to do, is to ensure that the full-time equivalent remains the same. We're also working very hard to ensure that the opportunities for all offer, which means that no young person will go without an offer of training, education or a job. We're also working very hard to make sure that the modern apprenticeships remain high, 25,000 a year for this Parliament. We exceeded it last year. So the number of opportunities for young people is higher than ever. Of course, there will be a variation if you move between different types of full and part-time courses. But to present it in that way, Mr. Bibby, is, I believe, not representing the reality of what is being delivered.
So Scotland's colleges aren't representing reality
No,
of what has been delivered?
I believe that the best way to present this is to present this as full-time equivalents, and that's what we do. And we work closely with Scotland's colleges, who I think themselves had to alter the figure. Having submitted it to the committee, they had to change it. And I think that indicates the difficulty of calculating this. One of the problems that does exist in this sector, and it's actually interesting in the light of the questioning so far to reflect on this point, one of the problems that does exist in this sector is the availability of good, reliable, firm data. And that's also why the outcome agreements are very, very important, because they tie colleges down to good, concrete data, which is verifiable year on year. And I think that's an important step forward.
We've seen a reduction in staff, we've seen a headcount reduction in student numbers. We've also seen reports of 10,000 people on waiting lists to get college places. You're shaking your head.
That's simply not true. I mean, I can see your thesis, you know, and you're entitled to your thesis. It is a thesis that's based upon your wish to make a political point. I don't think it actually presents the reality of the situation, and it certainly does nothing to help Scotland's young people. Now, you're entitled to that. You're a politician. But I think we should all, from time to time, step back and say, how are we helping young people? What we're doing here is creating a college sector that is more fit for purpose, that is focused upon outcomes, that is focused on individuals. You see, I do think that sometimes those who want to present that point need to just pause for a moment, decide what they're defending. They're defending a college system that was established by Michael Forsyth. By Michael Forsyth, that's what you're defending. A system which allows and indeed insists upon regional pay bargaining, something that apparently you're against. A system that in actual fact has not allowed young people to be at the focus of concerns, that has allowed the continuation of some essentially static management. So I think you're defending something that's pretty hard to defend, but then that perhaps is what you would like to do, but it's not what we need in Scotland.
In terms of the points I raised about staff numbers, that was been raised by the EIS. In terms of the points I've raised about student numbers, that was raised by Scotland's colleges. I'm raising concerns on behalf of people that have given evidence to this committee. My question was about waiting lists for college places. You said no, that's not the case. There has been no waiting list for college places. Is that what you're saying?
No, I think you have to know something about the college system before you would make that assertion. In actual fact, there will always be people who apply for more than one course. There will always be people who don't get on the course they first want to get on. There's never, ever any guarantee in any part of education that you will always get what you want as your first choice. So I think, to be fair, Mr. Bibby, you're endeavouring to put a series of worst possible constructions on the situation instead of being in favour of progressive change. That is your choice.
George Adam, followed by Liam McCarthy.
Yes, thank you, Convener. Morning, Cabinet Secretary. It was just to say I have already on the record with I found the figures to be faulty with the Scottish colleges, and I had some concerns with the rest of the paperwork as well, because it was such a crucial kind of way they were building their argument on that. But Mr Bibby seems to be making it up as he goes along, because, as you quite rightly said, they're trying to defend some kind of Thatcherite ideal. And it's nothing surprising, right enough. But also there was something said with the EIS with regards to, they actually mentioned at one point, which was quite a bizarre argument because Mr Bibby brought up as well. They were talking about, lecturers, how pay for lecturers, more investment in lecturers. But then you end up in a strange situation where if you've got student numbers, as the government's quite rightly done, is the most important thing, and if you don't have the students and the ability for them to be there, then there's no point in having the colleges or further education in the first place. But what I'm more interested in, and the most important thing to me, and I think it's sometimes it's bogged down in the politics, Cabinet Secretary, is that, the vision, the idea of the current FE college system isn't working to the best that it could be. And it's the vision thing that's more important to me, that young people can get an opportunity instead of going at 30 or 40 people that were hard to get to are going between 16 and 19. Can you possibly outline the kind of vision idea and tell us exactly the way we can go forward with this?
When you look at it's a very important point, Mr Adam, and I will want to expand upon it. When you look at the college sector as was, let's say a year ago, where you had something like 41, 42 colleges which were operating, duplicating everything. 42, in fact, actually 43, I think, sets of terms and conditions for staff, because one previous merger had still kept 2 sets of terms and conditions. A balkanisation of staff relationships and staff terms and conditions, and the duplication in every college of the mechanism to support that. A whole range of duplications where colleges set up, of course, under a Thatcherite model to compete with each other, who were competing with each other, even down to the most basic set of courses. You needed to get a strategic view for Scotland's learners and young people, and you needed to do it in a way that was delivering as effectively and as efficiently as possible. It is defending the indefensible to defend what was taking place. Now, this process of change is not easy, and it's made harder because of the cuts coming from the Liberals and Tories, which of course were originally devised by Labour. But in that period of time, we have been able to move it forward. And I pay tribute to college leadership, to people who are working in colleges, and to students themselves, who've backed and supported a series of changes so that we can get this to work well for Scotland's learners. And the point you make is crucial. This is about Scotland's young people and Scotland's employers and the opportunities for young people to go into work. And it does not say that anybody is so distant from the labour market that they cannot be helped and encouraged. I think one of the really inspirational colleges in Scotland is John Wheatley College. I talk about it quite often because a lot of the young people they deal with are very, very distant from the labour market. I know Claire Adamson knows the college well. Very, very distant. But the work that Alan Sherry and his team there do is to draw everybody in so that they get an opportunity. Now, one of the things I'm now moving on to, as I think members of the committee know, and I'm happy to talk about it at some stage, is to look at the pedagogy, the intellectual justification for, the rigour of the vocational and further education in Scotland, and to make sure that employers and educationalists are focused on the distinctive Scottish model. But to do that, we needed a mechanism to deliver it. And the mechanism we're putting in place is the mechanism that can deliver the benefits of curriculum for excellence and also feed into the benefits of Scottish higher education. And it is a continuum. Education is that continuum. And we're putting in place a really excellent part of it.
Thank you, Cabinet Secretary. Liam MacArthur.
Thank you, Convener. Cabinet Secretary referred to John Wheatley College. As I recall, the principal from that college last year in evidence that the committee expressed grave concerns about the impact of the government's proposal, particularly in terms of regionalisation and the impact that would have on the cohort of students that they deal so well with. In terms of the, I think earlier on you suggested delivering more for less, and Neil Bibby's referred to potential headcount reductions in student numbers and in terms of staff reductions. INEOS Scotland, in correspondence with myself last week, were saying we're still worried about the consequences of the £34 million cut that the budget proposes to colleges, particularly in terms of the quality of provision for students and of crucial support services like guidance, careers advice, counselling and so on. And this is a theme I think you'll recall from last year's evidence session as well. What sort of reassurances can you offer that in delivering more for less, what's not being pared back is the quality of the courses that are actually being delivered?
Okay, just on the John Wheatley point, I've spent a lot of time talking to and working with a range of college people over the last year, and certainly I've spent time with Alan Sherry and John Wheatley, and I hope I've reassured him that the changes are changes that will be beneficial for the students and the excellent work he has done in the East End of Glasgow, he and his predecessors have done. I spent some time talking to the NUS last week. We discussed this very point of view. I hope that we will do everything we possibly can to reassure them that the cuts imposed upon us from Liberals and Tories, but let us not forget that those cuts, and originated by Labour, I don't want to miss that point out, those cuts are things that we will do our best to mitigate. It is necessary, unfortunately, in the public sector to do more for less, but I am quite confident in the college sector that is being done. And of course, I will always look for opportunities to help students where I can.
It's interesting, the narrative about this being the result of cuts and not the choices that the Scottish Government has made or decisions they've chosen not to take in order to free up resource is conveniently parked at the side. In relation to the regionalisation agenda, we've got a SPICE briefing on the status so far. I think it outlines 2 federations and 7 mergers, and in exchanges with myself in the chamber you indicated that it wasn't a one-size-fits-all, that you were looking to use the Transformation Fund to support different types of models depending on circumstances. Can you perhaps update the committee on the amount of the 15 million Transformation Fund that has been expended to date in delivering the 7 mergers and 2 federations, what the breakdown of that is?
I'm happy to write to the member with a full account of the fund. I mean, the fund is still being spent. There are still things going on. We've only had 2 complete mergers so far, Edinburgh and SRUC, both of which took place in the first week of this month. It is quite a fluid situation. For example, one federation may turn into a merger. Discussions are taking place. Tayside, where there was no movement really for a long time, is now decided to merge Angus and Dundee. So I think rather than go through what would be a partial story, I'll write to the member and copy the committee of all the transactions under the fund. One of the interesting things is in the Auditor General's report, the state of college reserves are very high indeed. So of course we expect colleges to contribute to the merger process, and they are so doing. The City of Edinburgh merger resulted, I think, in 40% of the cost being met from the college's own reserves. But I'll give you a detailed accounting of the expenditure, and we can update that from time to time.
No, I appreciate that. It's difficult to set in that. Yeah. Just in relation, though, to the point made by Audit Scotland, about the complex change on the scale will inevitably lead to some disruption during the transition period. Further work is required to identify and articulate the costs and benefits of regionalisation. I don't think that caught anybody necessarily by surprise. What was perhaps surprising was Mark Batho's suggestion that the savings that would be released through these merger processes would be released in a time frame that would allow them to be reinvested and indeed to mitigate some of the cuts that we've been discussing. What sort of time frame are you envisaging? And do you agree with Mark Batho, or do you agree with Scottish Colleges, who certainly question
2014-15, we anticipate a saving of £50 million. And that is, we believe, a conservative estimate. I think, sorry, Andrew's correcting me, £52 million, 2014-15. That's the SFC estimate. I respect the SFC's work on this. They're close to the college sector. We'll see as it moves on.
Colleges are close to the Scottish college
yeah.
sector. And
colleges will see their own individual pictures. They won't see the bigger picture.
We've got we're trying to get through quite a lot of stuff this morning. I do want to move on at all possible, but I'll take very quickly questions from Mr Finlay, Liz Smith and Claire Adamson on this subject before we move on to outcome agreements.
I noticed when you refer to another party or another government that you refer to cuts, but when you refer to your own, it's savings. That's just something I've noted in your dialogue. But it appears that we're living in two parallel worlds here. But in the world of the Cabinet Secretary, we have cuts being exaggerated, waiting lists being exaggerated, job losses being exaggerated, and improving staff relations. And in the real world, we have 70,000 places cut. We have capital cut by 82 million. We have 1,300 staff lost their jobs. Now, is all this wrong?
Mr Finlay, you argue this case every time you stand up in the chamber. I don't think your world is the real world. I think your world is the world that you would like to exist, because if it did exist, it would justify the attitudes you take. The reality of this is there is a difficult process of change underway. It is progressive change. It is change driven by both financial circumstances coming from Westminster and by a desire to deliver more and better for Scotland's young people. I would have thought that's an aspiration we could share across the committee. And therefore, I think what I'm expressing to you are the facts of the matter. But I've indicated to you, I take very seriously the Audit Scotland report, and yes, it's important that we are transparent. I've indicated to you, and indeed the evidence is there, that we listen very carefully to concerns, and where it is possible, we meet those concerns, for example, with additional resource. We did it last year, we've done it this year. When you do so, then you attack us for confusing people. So I think I'm trying very hard to represent what I think is the reality of the situation. Clearly, our worlds are not coinciding.
I think that's absolutely right, and I know which one I live in. The Scottish Colleges letter tells us student numbers fell by 70,000. The SPICE briefing tells us that capital funding for colleges has fallen from a peak of 109 million in financial year 2010-11, and then it says this is likely to provide around 27 million for colleges in the 2013 allocation. The EIS and SPICE both tell us that 1,300 staff have lost their jobs. All of them you are telling us are wrong, and the world that the picture that you paint is correct.
No,
that's what you're telling us.
No, and that's not what I've said, and I've been at pains not to say that. I've gone through each of those items. I've explained what I think the item means. For example, just to do it again under the capital thing, of course, we've switched to NPD on some of the capital funding, so capital funding actually is very high. But if you only look at it in one way, then you will get a different figure. I just think, Mr Finlay, I mean, I'm a realist, after many years in politics. I don't think you and I are going to agree on this. I think what we're trying to do is to improve the lot of Scotland's young people, to help them very greatly, to make sure we train, and the outcomes of that will be clear to see. I think the outcomes are already clear to see. I'm just sorry you won't accept it.
Liz Smith and then Claire Adamson.
Cabinet Secretary, it is your job, obviously, to decide on the priorities within your budget, whatever that budget may be. Could you explain your rationale behind why you have cut the teaching budget to a greater proportion than other aspects of the college budget in light of your commitment to 16 to 19-year-olds and in the middle of a very deep economic recession?
Well, I mean, the recession manufactured by overcutting by George Osborne with Liberal support, the recession and financial difficulties manufactured by the Westminster system, which fortunately we will have an opportunity to get out of, I hope, in 2 years' time, Those are hard things to deal with. And yes, we have to make decisions within them. I think the overall decision on colleges is the right decision. Teaching budgets are a very substantial part of that, and therefore they will obviously be part of the cutting process. But I would want to go through the budget for colleges line by line to show you how, in actual fact, the reductions are being handled college by college and the different choices that people are making.
Claire Adamson.
Cabinet Secretary, can I thank you for reminding us about the set-up under Michael's Forsyth of the current area for the colleges, and of course over the years that has led to considerable problems with accountability as industrial unrest across the sector during that period. So let's not forget the problems that have been there. But what I'd really like to ask about is the Audit Scotland report has also shown that there are surpluses of over 200 million within the sector, and also reserves in some of the colleges, and obviously that varies depending on how they were managed, and there's quite considerable variance. But given that there's 200 million of reserves as well, can you suggest how maybe the college sector could be using those monies at this stage?
In some circumstances, reserves are working capital, of course. I'd want to be fair about that, and that working capital is necessary for the day-to-day operation of complex colleges. Colleges are often complex institutions with lots of different things happening. But I think the establishment of reserves very much from public expenditure, because you must remember that most colleges, the very, very largest proportion of their income comes from the state. The establishment of those reserves is something that we need to talk about and to say how best they could be applied to the sector, particularly in times of change. Now, again, to be very fair, the principals of the colleges, and I talk to principals and chairs and others all the time, recognise that the surpluses that they have should be invested in the process of change. And indeed, as I've indicated, the cost of the Edinburgh College merger, 40% of that cost came from and is coming from the reserves that the Edinburgh colleges come. And I would expect that the cost of merger right across Scotland and Federation will be substantially supported by reserves. Now, other investment takes place too. Colleges very often build up reserves when they're looking for capital to take forward substantial capital investment, and they put a proportion of that in. And almost every college, we've had a huge job of renewing the college estate. I mean, contrary to what it looks like from a planet Finlay, it looks very different when you go out there and look at the world as it is in the colleges, because new buildings everywhere. And those of you who go to, John Wheatley College, everybody within their constituency or region will go to new colleges and see new investment. Now, fortunately, that has taken place before the huge cut in capital investment coming from south of the border. But there's still some capital plans that have to be fulfilled, and some of that reserve will go there.
Right. The Audit Scotland report was pretty clear on this. We're talking between cash in hand and reserves of around about £411 million. That seems to me quite a high amount of reserves and cash in hand. Is that, historically speaking, are you able to tell us whether or not that's higher than usual?
It's certainly grown in recent years. This is not news, of course. The Griggs report into college governance drew attention to the issue of reserves and proposed a mechanism by which the reserves would be clawed back. Now, given the process of change and the need to invest in change, I am of the view that colleges should be encouraged to invest themselves in that. So I've made no proposals to claw back reserves. But there is an issue, and it's an issue that needs to be discussed. Those reserves have grown, and those reserves have grown in recent years, and those reserves come from public money. So I think that the time for investment is now, and I'm glad that colleges see it the same way. To be honest, I've had no difficulty in that discussion with college chairs or principals. I think they recognise that investing in the process of change is above all investing in Scotland's young people. It's not about institutions, and indeed, one of the ways we're moving forward and away from that negative Thatcherite, Labour-supported view of colleges is looking at the colleges as institutions that serve young people, not as institutions that look after themselves.
Thank you very much for that. We did want to move on to outcome agreements. I think Claire Adamson had a question on that.
Yeah, Cabinet Secretary, you mentioned outcome agreements in your opening statement, and obviously they're to be welcomed, both in the higher education and further education sector. Can we just have a bit of a reassurance that they are fit for purpose, they will be able to hold colleges to account, and that you're confident going forward that this is the mechanism to monitor what's happening?
We've had a very good first outing on outcome agreements, both for higher and further education. I think it's important we bring that in. It was a new process, bound to be a testing time. It also came at a slightly awkward time of the year. The right time to do outcome agreements is now, looking forward for the next year, rather than doing outcome agreements, which we did really in the summer, the spring and summer, which was a bit later than they should have been done. But everybody got, I think, benefited from the experience. Interesting, in higher education, I think there was probably more reservation about whether they would work, and there's been a greater sense that they have worked well for them. They've not been bureaucratic. In the college sector, we've had a good first run out. We've now done a review of the outcome agreements, just been finished, an independent review of them. I think we've learned quite a lot of how we can take them forward, and I think they'll be a very, very valuable tool. They'll also simplify the relationship. Because, you know, there were a variety of mechanisms. One of them was a strategic examination of colleges every year. A number were chosen by the SFC and done in that way. That won't be necessary. You know, if we have an inspection process under HMIE, and if we have the outcome agreements, we'll have a very solid set of data and information that will allow us to understand how things are being done. And it's on an annual basis. So I think this is very positive. And I think the colleges have found it a positive. It's also transparent. I mean, in terms of information provided and concerns there's not enough information. I mean, this is much more information that we'll ever have had about how colleges are operating and how universities are operating too. Also ties us to some progress. I mean, there haven't been any questions about it, but I should mention widening access, particularly in higher education. Outcome agreements will be the vehicle by which we can confirm that.
Liam MacArthur.
So quick things, just on that widening that access issue, in relation to the guidance letter that you issued, there is talk of additional investment for incentivising this. I mean, you might not be able to set out the detail of how you expect that to work now, but certainly that'd be something I think.
It is. I do anticipate that in the legislation, the forthcoming legislation, which this committee will consider, then the access agreement issue will be enshrined in legislation. The access issue will be enshrined in legislation through the outcome agreement process, and part of that will be incentivisation, carrots and sticks. And I think we need both carrots and sticks for widening access, and that's what we're going to provide. But for the first time, anywhere in these islands, we'll have legislation that underpins the way in which we want to expand access, which is also, as you know, done institution by institution. I mean, this is not one size fits all. There is. I was at a meeting on Saturday in the fringe of the SNP conference organised by University of Scotland. We heard two inspirational students from St Andrews, a university which has been some criticism, talking about one person who left school at 16, went back at 25, and is studying social anthropology. Another student from a single-parent family in a high school in Kirkcaldy who was encouraged to aspire to go to St Andrews and is studying sociology, I think, there. And both of those young people talking about how access had changed their lives, the possibility of access had changed their lives. We need to do more of that.
Certainly agree. In terms of the outcome agreements for the FE sectors compared to the HE sector, of course, the FE sector has a vital role in delivering a significant amount of HE. Is there anything in relation to the outcome agreements or in relation to this budget you can suggest would see an evening up of the amount that is paid to colleges for the delivery of HE as compared to what is
it's raised at the committee, and it's an interesting point. There are some substantial differences in delivery and substantial differences in the cost of delivery, and one of those lies in the slightly crude information that is provided on an average basis of how much a student costs, second-year student costs, first-year student costs particularly. In universities, those figures are averaged across essentially a whole course, which is 4 years, sometimes more. In the college sector, they're averaged year on year, so it looks as if colleges are cheaper than universities, but universities are adding in certain costs that colleges don't have. I think it's useful, actually, for the university sector to recognise that sometimes colleges can deliver very high-quality higher education in a cheaper fashion, and I hope that focuses some minds. So I'm very willing to have that discussion. I don't think parity of esteem in delivery always equates to parity of payment in delivery, because I think sometimes there are other costs that are being borne, for example, in the university sector, because all universities that we have are also research universities. We should remember that.
But what you're suggesting would tend to suggest a levelling down rather than a levelling up.
No, I would just say that it's important that both sides recognise that, but particularly universities, that there are ways of delivering higher education, but there are many different ways of delivering it. I wouldn't insist on any one way of delivering higher education. I'm saying not all costs are comparable, but it's a useful discussion to have. And I think the NUS were right to raise it.
We only have a few minutes left, but I want to turn to the overarching government's purpose and how education fits into that. So we've got very little time, but 3 questioners. I want to start with Neil Bibby, then Joan, and then Colin.
In terms of economic growth, Cabinet Secretary, Scotland's colleges, the EIS, Unison, NUS and others have stated that your cuts to colleges will put economic recovery, or could put economic recovery at risk. Are they all wrong?
It's an amazing dichotomy that you and your colleague, Mr. Finlay, want to present all the time. You know, what they are saying is that we need to invest in our young people. We need to make sure that we are focused on providing skills to young people. We need to make sure that those young people that get opportunities to grow and to flourish. I believe that what we're doing will have those outcomes. In any process of change, there will be difficulties, there will be disagreements. But I believe what we're doing, and indeed that is the view of the Cabinet, because obviously the Cabinet looks at reform. These reforms are reforms that are focused on the government's purpose and will help to contribute to the government's purpose.
Okay, Joan McAlpine.
Yes, you talked earlier, Cabinet Secretary, about changing the focus onto learners and employers and not institutions. We took some evidence at our previous session from the Federation of Small Businesses, who said that up until now, surveys showed that just 10% of their members had been contacted by colleges. And I wondered whether in what way the change of culture that you're hoping to drive might change that situation for the better.
I think the regional focus is a very important part of that, and the legislation will require the regional boards to ensure that they are plugged into and working with a whole range of organisations and interests across their region. But if you take that regional view, if you're not locked in competition, one college with another, sometimes in the next street virtually, but you take the regional and strategic view of how we can deliver, then I would hope that there will be a big increase in that interface. And indeed, what I'm trying to do now with taking forward the idea of the Scottish vocational model and the work we're going to do in that in the next year, I would hope that business, industry and small business will all be part of that process. So they're seeing the change taking place so that the delivery is what they need. We can get better than that. I know some of the debate that the committee has had and others have had about the oil and gas sector and the skills in that, shown that we need to focus ever more closely on the relationship between training and employment and training and economic opportunity, and to draw in, no matter how distant from the labour market, those young people that can be part of that, and older people too, because it's still a substantial provision for older people and for reskilling, and business and industry also has a strong role in helping with that.
And would that also underpin the shift of the transfer of money towards Skills Development Scotland for providing courses in colleges?
We should see SDS and the college sector and others as part of the whole. I mean, one of the problems in the college sector has been, there's been a lump of money for the college sector, a lump of money for SDS, lump of money here, without coordinating this activity. Last year we started in the process of funding a number of college places that were funded through SDS and an SDS model rather than being funded in another way. And that's been a helpful thing to do. Similarly, the modern apprenticeships are all employed. That's an important thing in Scotland, but they all have training opportunities. So that also plugs things together. One of the mistakes in looking at the college sector, and I think it's a mistake, to be honest, that we've heard again this morning, one of the mistakes is to see the college sector in a box and to say young people go in one end and come out the other end, and it's discrete from all the other parts of what we're doing. What we have to see is a learner journey, a skills continuum, a whole range of players involved, focused on the young person or focused on the trainee, not focused on the institutions. That institutional view, established by Michael Forsyth, is a view we now can do without in Scotland.
Just one factual point, if I may, convener. Yes. There has been talk earlier from other members of the committee about falling student numbers, and I think the 70,000 was mentioned. Would those student numbers include, say, someone like a person like myself taking an hour a week flower arranging?
The concept of you as a demon flower arranger is one I'm having slight difficulty with. But yes, I mean, broadly, that is one of the issues. I mean, it's at the extreme end of it. But, you know, there are a range of opportunities in colleges, nothing wrong with them, quite legitimate, but are taken in this catch-all. And, you know, you need an understanding of the sector to see that and perhaps to react to figures in a different way.
Thank you. Final question from Colin Beattie.
Cabinet Secretary, in recent times, innovation centres have become quite in vogue, and I've had the opportunity to visit several. And they seem to have slightly different models and slightly different anticipated outcomes surrounding these centres. And I wondered if there was any measurement or any projections of how these innovation centres are going to impact on graduate employability and entrepreneurship, and how ultimately on the labour market.
Yeah. Yeah. There's a process of establishing innovation centres, as you know, which draws in money from a variety of funders. I mean, I think it's a good question, and I would suspect, although I would want to find this out, I would suspect that the funders themselves will be involved in an assessment of them. I think the people who are operating innovation centres, doing it in different models, are learning from that experience. I would also expect them to report on it, but the Funding Council would also have a role in ensuring that the innovation centres are providing what they say, and Scottish Enterprise would have as well. It's a good question. I think we probably need to look at it in some detail, and I will write to you to see what the process is.
Thank you very much, Cabinet Secretary. That's the end of the session, but obviously we didn't really have enough time to cover some of the questions we'd like to have. So if you don't mind, I will write to you with some more detailed questions. But can I ask your officials to ensure that they get a reply back to us by the 30th of October, given the deadlines we have?
Absolutely. I mean, I'm grateful for the opportunity to talk exclusively, virtually about colleges, but there are many, many other things happening, and I think it's important to look at them and to welcome them.
Indeed. Thank you very much. I suspend briefly. Can I welcome to the committee Fiona Hislop, MSP, Cabinet Secretary for External Affairs. Good morning, Cabinet Secretary. But can I also welcome Wendy Wilkinson, Deputy Director, Culture Division, David Sears, Team Leader, Cultural Excellence, both Scottish Government, and Miriam Madden, Director of Finance, Historic Scotland. In addition to taking evidence on the draft budget, the committee this morning will follow up on issues raised during the one-off evidence sessions on culture that we held during September. For example, cultural trusts, Creative Scotland and possibly the Youth Music Initiative. The committee also took evidence, I'm sure as you're aware, Cabinet Secretary, on charges for school music tuition. We will follow this up with you at a later date, because we understand that the Scottish Government is currently assessing its survey of local authorities in terms of the policy in this area. Is that correct?
The Education Department, or the Youth Music Initiative, is not about school tuition.
No, I'm separating the two out. Yes. Okay. I'm very keen to get through as much as possible in terms of the time we have available this morning. The Cabinet Secretary has to leave us by around 10:45. So if members could make their questions succinct and also the answers, that would be very helpful. And can I invite the Cabinet Secretary to make an opening statement?
Thank you, Convener. I'll be brief because I know that we want to move on to questions. As the committee will be aware, the 2013-14 draft budget confirms the spending plans for the portfolio previously set out in the Spending Review 2011. This Government is therefore continuing to support artists, cultural opportunities and cultural excellence through investment in Creative Scotland, the National Performing Companies and the National Collections, and I have protected their operating budgets as far as possible. Our cultural sector continues to support economic growth through the creative industries, opportunities for cultural tourism, while also access to high-quality cultural events and opportunities enhances quality of life for communities, and also essentially supporting artists in their work. These national performing companies or collections will receive minor reductions in core funding, but these were planned for in the Spending Review 2011, and the bodies have had time to plan to accommodate these. We're also continuing to invest in skills through the Young Scots Fund, providing £12.5 million in 2013-14 for investment across portfolios in emerging young talent in creativity, enterprise and sport. On capital, the key difference between the draft budget for 2013-14 and the spending review for 2011 is the additional capital budget I've been able to secure for the portfolio. In line with the Scottish Government's commitment to support economic recovery and create more jobs, capital investment for the Culture and External Affairs portfolio is increasing to £17 million next financial year. Now, this is almost doubling what we set out in the 2011 spending review. This includes an additional £1 million for Historic Scotland to help with the maintenance of its extensive estate, as well as confirming funding already committed to the V&A at Dundee, the redevelopment of the Glasgow Theatre Royal and the Glasgow Royal Concert Hall, the Battle of Bannockburn Visitor Centre, and shovel-ready maintenance and refurbishment projects across my portfolio. However, it remains the case that as a consequence of the reductions in my budget made in Spending Review 2011, the Scottish Government will be unable to respond to additional requests for funding received throughout the year. I'm again challenging the bodies we fund to develop creative, innovative and collaborative solutions to the funding pressures that we all face. I also know the committee had a particular interest on carbon emissions, and I have replied to your letter of the 5th of October on that particular issue. I hope this overview gives you a context of the developments since the spending review of 2011, and I look forward to any questions that you have for me.
Thank you very much, Cabinet Secretary. Can I just begin by asking you about the capital allocations that you mentioned, particularly in relation to Historic Scotland? Clearly, the additional funding is welcome in this area, but can I ask you to give us some sort of context for the kind of pressures on that particular budget? I'm sure all of us know in our own regions and constituencies the pressure on historic properties in terms of maintenance and repair. You yourself visited, along with myself, Dumbarton Castle earlier this year and saw some of the issues of the work that had to be done there. So there is an extra allocation. You mentioned what that's for, but could you put that in the context of the kind of pressures on Historic Scotland's budget?
Okay. Well, I think a couple of things. First of all, in relation to capital, that we have not historically provided capital for Historic Scotland. What we have done is provide revenue funding which can then be used for capital grants and investments in current grants for frontline investments by Historic Scotland, but also their investments in other organisations that provide. So actually, the capital, in terms of current grants that are given to help invest in repairs, maintenance by all the different funding bodies that help develop it, whether it's through town centres or other areas. The current grants have actually been maintained at £14.6 million for the 2012-13 current year and also for 13-14. So one of the things, despite the pressures on the revenue budget, we're managing to ensure that the frontline grants that go to help repair all the properties and their approach to help support, that's been maintained. What you're actually seeing is capital investment that's helping particularly through some of the other areas, whether it's through the Young Scot Fund for the National Conservation Centre or indeed through support for Bannockburn through investment from Historic Scotland to support National Trust's exercise. So actually, if you're looking at the capital side of things, things have been fairly well protected on that side. The pressures, which I explained last year, were to do with how do we make sure that Historic Scotland can continue to look at different ways of generating income. They've been very successful at that. So despite the fact they've had a substantial reduction in their budget, as I discussed with the committee last year, what they are doing is replacing that income by outside income generation, and they're actually doing that very successfully. Having said that, I would say to the committee that this year, as you'll have seen from some of the tourist figures, particularly because of the really bad weather in June and July, has had an adverse impact. Particularly, I think, in properties that are not in the centre, but more rural areas. Now, that's impacting lots of tourism is obviously a responsibility of another committee. So we are keeping very close contact with Historic Scotland about how their income generation is going. But that was the reason we could reduce their budget to protect all the other things I've told you about, was because they were replacing government income by income streams from other income generation, not least from travel to tourism. But that's one of the areas that has been particularly difficult over the recent months.
Thank you very much for that. Neil Findlay.
Yeah, just looking in general at your role, Cabinet Secretary, we had Mr Youssef at the committee a few weeks back who explained quite extensively about his new role and responsibilities, and it would appear that there's a major duplication there, and I'm just wondering whether you think your role still justifies a cabinet position given the duplication, and whether the associated budget that comes with that, because there is, I mean, looking at what the online at the Scottish Government website, does appear to be quite a significant amount of duplication between the two roles.
Just before the Cabinet Secretary responds, this is a questioning session about the budget.
I'm saying there's associated costs according to with that, obviously.
Well, if the Cabinet Secretary wants to respond on the budgetary aspects, I'm more than happy.
Yeah, I think there's two aspects of that. One is that if you only think somebody should have a cabinet status because of the size of the budget, I think you're saying a lot about what Labour's approach to the value and importance of culture, that it only matters in terms of the size of the budget, and I think that's quite a worrying statement to make. I also think it's quite worrying that any party or any member would think that culture doesn't deserve a cabinet place in the Scottish Government, and I think a lot of people would be very alarmed at those concerns. But actually, in terms of reach and range, one of the big constraints I've had over the recent times is the amount of invitations I get to attend lots of different events. So, for example, yesterday I had to ask for Mr Youssef to deputise for me at an event because I was launching the Sydney Opera House as the next of the Scottish 10 to be scanned. Interestingly, at that event, I also, convener, met the individual who has been, whose company has been scanning Dumbarton Rock, precisely to look at some of the kind of issues around whether there needs to be repairs or concerns around the rock itself. So you can't physically be two places at one time. And I was the only Cabinet Secretary that didn't have another minister. And the international interest is huge in what we do. And there's big links, as the Sydney Opera House showed us, between our international work and also our cultural and heritage work. So I feel passionately that culture deserves its place at the heart of the Scottish Government, and I'm very pleased that we have that position, and I would be very worried indeed, and I hope perhaps the committee can give some expression in their budget response that they also think that culture deserves its place at the Cabinet, because I think that's a very worrying development if that's something that the member believes.
No, the previous person to give evidence to the committee was very careful about asking people not to misquote them, and I never said any of that. What I said was the duplication of roles. That's where I questioned that.
Well, I can certainly make sure that we can give an explanation, for example, where my Minister, Mr Yousaf, gave evidence on a National Records of Scotland, a piece of regulations at the committee. I think I was pursuing, at the time, I need to check my diary, I'm happy to come back and confirm it, but I think at that time I was in Ireland, in Dublin, promoting Scotland's economic interests, which I think is correct to do. So I think it's very important that we have ministers that can field and operate in different areas, and I think this is a very, very important one indeed.
Thank you very much, Cabinet Secretary. Joan McAlpine.
Yes, thank you very much, Convener. You'll be aware, Cabinet Secretary, that we took evidence from the Chief Executive of Creative Scotland at one of our previous sessions, in which he gave a fairly robust defence of his organisation following criticisms from the cultural sector. Since that session, 100 of our leading artists have written an open letter criticising Creative Scotland in very, very robust terms indeed. So clearly Mr Dixon's appearance before the committee didn't do anything to reassure them, and I think what struck many people was that the range of names, and also the fact that many of the names were household names, like the Macker, Liz Lockhead. Now, I know that you have written several times to Creative Scotland urging them to improve their communications with the cultural sector, and I wondered what your response was to that latest concern, and if such concerns continue, what you're able to do in order to put further pressure on Mr Dixon's organisation.
Well, clearly, I've already said publicly that I think that the letter that was written expressed serious concerns. Some of those concerns, and I think some of the concerns we've seen, are about developments prior to the establishment of Creative Scotland. Some of them are about the operations within Creative Scotland, and some of them are about how they're responding to things. I'm very heartened that the Board of Creative Scotland have responded to my requests. I gave a letter of guidance in July where I specifically said that I wanted to have better engagement between Creative Scotland and understanding and relationships with the sector. I think trust is a very important thing. It's very precious. It's something that perhaps you can't put an economic value on. And we have a fantastic cultural and artistic experience here in Scotland. We have got great artists, and it's always been a challenge, and this is not a new challenge. This is something that, and I know many of these members here are new from either 2011 or indeed 2007, but this has been an ongoing issue about how you can have a strategic and flexible cultural organisation, but at the same time allow the freedom of artists to pursue what they need to do. And I feel very passionately about the independence of artists to be able to do that and the support they need. Now, quite clearly, the operations of Creative Scotland have not delivered that. I've been quite specific in my request to the board to sort this out. In terms of the statement that I'm not sure members will be aware of, but the board agreed to a way forward, and a statement was issued by the chair, Sir Sandy Crombie, only yesterday, and I suggest I'm quite happy to make sure that that comes to the committee and you all get a chance to read it. But he has made specific responses that they will, one, engage with artists and their concerns in a way they haven't been doing to date, and I welcome that. They will look at the role of specialist knowledge, which was one of the challenges and concerns that the artists had. They will simplify the language processes and forms that they use. They will reaffirm their commitment to long-term funding. Now, again, that was an issue specifically raised, I think, with the committee at their evidence session, that they would engage more meaningfully in debate and dialogue. And there's a big difference from hearing and listening and then understanding and acting, and it's the understanding and acting that I want to see them focus on. And they will register and review feedback and complaints, because that's been one of the issues, that although people have been trying to communicate, it's not, the response hasn't been adequate, and I recognise that. But importantly, and probably because we need, I think, to come back to the budget position, I have protected Creative Scotland's budget as far as I can. They've got a far less reduction than other parts of the sector, particularly as we've heard from Historic Scotland or indeed the National Records of Scotland. But also in terms of the initial issue that kind of sparked some of this was about the flexible funding organisations. The first 14 of those have been now reviewed, and I have looked at the figures between what these organisations received for the previous 2 years and what they're going to receive for the next 2 years. And they are getting the same amount of money by and large. There's only one organisation that's not getting 2-year funding, and they requested not to get 2-year funding. But that doesn't, I think, get over the fact that there needs to be improvements, and I take my responsibility very seriously, and I'm very passionate about supporting artists in Scotland. I'll continue to do so, and I'm very pleased and welcome the positive responses I've had privately from artists. Very pleased at the activity and the actions that I've taken as your Cabinet Secretary for Culture.
Is it something that you're going to be monitoring? Because obviously you've now written several letters to Creative Scotland, and we're still getting really prominent artists coming forward who don't seem to have any confidence in the organisation. When does the point come where...
To be fair, the two areas that they're looking at, particularly lottery and the overall operations, they had initiated this work when initial contact had been made, for example, by a group of 5 organisations who wrote to me in June, and I asked the board then to take action and meet with them. Now, they've been meeting on a regular basis with government involvement, so that included the Federation of Scottish Theatres, the Literature Forum, and indeed the most recent of those meetings took place the same day as the letter was published. And ironically, at that meeting, they said that they were quite comfortable with the relationship and how they were actually making the improvements, and they no longer required Scottish Government involvement in terms of chairing that meeting. So I think part of what we have to do is make sure that Creative Scotland communicate more openly about what actions have been taken. So unfortunately, the people who are obviously signatories to the letter will not have been aware of the actions that the board are taking. I think it's absolutely essential that the board are more transparent, and the organisation itself is more transparent about what they're doing. And that's why I welcome not only the statement that was made today, made yesterday from the board about the actions they're taking, but they will continue to communicate more widely to make sure people are aware of it. But I think that's the essence of this. It's so precious, our culture. We have to make sure it's nurtured and supported in a way. And it's a different funding arrangements and different supports than you get for other sectors. And we have to be responsive to those needs. And I think 2 years on, it's absolutely quite right for the board to look and say, actually, are you delivering for all the functions? There's a lot of great work happening there. And the one thing I do want to put on record, there's a lot of really good people working within Creative Scotland that are supporting projects right across the country in lots of different places across Scotland in different sectors. And I think we need to make sure the talent within the organisation flourishes, but most importantly, they support the talent that we have in Scotland.
Neil Bibby.
Thanks, Convener. It's been mentioned that you wrote to Creative Scotland on a number of occasions over the last few months. Given that you wrote to the Chair of Creative Scotland in March of this year approving its corporate plan, and again in July of this year, I understand praising the organisation for fulfilling its administrative requirements and the new direction and model outlined in the plan, do you accept that you bear any responsibility for the unrest and protest within the creative community? If you approve the plan, do you assume ultimate responsibility?
The corporate plan, interestingly, has not been the subject that I'm aware of the major concerns. The major concerns that have been raised about the operation within the administration of funding and how the relationships have been developing, not the corporate plan itself. Had it been the corporate plan, I'm sure that this organisation... Remember, the corporate plan was produced, was it March last year? The date, was it March 2011? So I kind of think that if that had been the issue that you're saying, that your committee would have taken issue with it, I would have taken issues, others would. So I don't think the corporate plan has been the issue here. Having said that, if as a result of the review that the board is carrying out on the different areas, that changes are needed to be made to the corporate plan, I think they should be made. And that's why I think in answer to Joe McAlpine's question about monitoring, absolutely, I will monitor to make sure that any changes that need to be implemented will be implemented.
So you may review the corporate plan that was approved?
Well, that's what you do when you think you need to change, if you need to change course and direction. But I would reiterate, had there been issues with the corporate plan, there would have been one, as part, there was a very wide-ranging consultation in developing it, but I think we would have, and your committee itself would have been more alert to it last year in March 2011, which, you know, if you think about it now, is like 18 months ago, as opposed to, I think, what's happened is the flexible funding changes have been a catalyst, I think, for concerns which are about more deeper relationships issues, and that's the core that we have to sort, and that's the core issue that I'm determined will be sorted.
Thank you very much, Cabinet Secretary. I mean, you've hinted at the delicate balance that needs to be struck here in terms of nurturing the widest possible sort of cultural and artistic expression. I certainly recognise that difficult balance, and also that there is a lag effect in terms of agreeing changes and those changes being implemented. But as Joe McAlpine said, there's letters being sent, I think in June you've said, and then again in September. I think, are we now at the point where you believe that there will be no further expression of the sort that we've seen in the last few weeks, that you're confident that the board is seized of what it is that you expect them to deliver and are making the changes in the right areas that, albeit over the course of a number of weeks, possibly months, to implement, will have the effect of addressing the concerns that we've seen from, as Joan was suggesting, some fairly prominent figures within the cultural community in Scotland?
I think your point about, are the board seized of the importance of this issue and are they acting on it? I think I can say to you, yes, they are. And I think that's the important point about delivering the change. We're going to have to give them some space to do that. Your question about whether there'll be any other concerns or protests raised, it's kind of, I can't predict that. I would hope that people will be reassured by the statement that was issued yesterday, but then we need to make sure people are aware of that statement. And it might be helpful if I sent a copy of that to all members, so that should they be approached by constituents, that they can help communicate that, because that's part of our responsibility, not just as obviously myself as the Cabinet Secretary, but all of us as MSPs, if we're approached by this, to inform people about what changes and developments are taking place. But of course it's a challenge, but the important thing is that I spoke to Sir Sandy Crombie only yesterday when he was informing me of the statement that was being issued yesterday, that they are absolutely seized by this and they're really determined to make a change and a difference. And there's some very good board members there who will help drive the organisation forward, and that's their role and responsibility. And it's kind of, as you'll know, having worked in government in a different, from a different perspective, you have to have some degree of distance, because as you know, and time and time again, whether it was the National Libraries Bill or other areas, you're constantly saying that you want to make sure that ministers don't interfere too much in the operations of artistic and cultural bodies. But as soon as there's an issue, you expect me to be the one that is in there sorting it out. And I'm doing that, but I have to respect the role of the board in doing so. And that's why I've charged them with change. And that's why they are implementing that change.
I again, certainly appreciate that that balance that needs to be struck, and without wanting to undercut either Andrew Dixon or Sandy Crombie and the board, given the individuals that signed up to this most recent letter of concern, have there been direct approaches to you in order to enable you and perhaps Mr Youssef to set out where you expect Creative Scotland to be going?
I regularly meet artists at different events. I'm very supportive of the work that Scotland's artists do, and but many of the approaches that would come to me would not be something that I could divulge, because people have spoken to me on a private basis that they don't want that discussed. But I've heeded the approaches that have been made to me. I've taken action as far back as the period in May-June when the flexible funding concerns were first being raised, and indeed where, to be fair to the 5 organisations that wrote to me, I responded immediately by setting up a meeting which the government chaired in June to set and train some of these changes. Now, the board chose not to make public the changes that we're wanting to make at that, or starting to make at that stage. I'm very pleased now the board is being more upfront about the changes that they're proposing, but most importantly, it's the dialogue and debate. And Scotland is it's a kind of it's a country where collaboration and that dialogue and debate should always take place between our cultural bodies and also our artists. That's kind of the nature of who we are, and I don't want this to be something that is just swept away. I do want to see change, and I expect change.
Liz Smith.
Cabinet Secretary, we've obviously taken quite a lot of evidence recently about the issue of cultural trusts. And you've made a point several times, both at committee and previous appearances and in the chamber, that you're obviously under very tight financial constraints when you're deciding where the financial spending should be. But obviously cultural trusts provide a possible scope for some additional funding. Could you tell us whether the Scottish Government has undertaken any work that looks at the efficacy of cultural trusts and whether there is a lot of scope for additional funding through that kind of angle?
I think one of the issues about cultural trusts is that it shouldn't just all be about money. It should actually be about the policies and indeed the provision and the quality of the arts and culture that they support, both for artists but also for the communities they serve. And I think the attraction for cultural trusts has been financial and to do with business rates and charitable status, etc. But I think they should be judged on a wider canvas. In terms of what the Scottish Government has done, I haven't conducted a piece of work into this area. I am very interested in the work that you're doing. I don't think we should duplicate each other. I think part of what we should do in our relationship is if we're looking at something, we can share it with you and vice versa. But what I have done, which has never existed before, is I've brought together culture conveners from across Scotland, because previously there had never been a forum within COSLA, for example, that they would come together on a regular basis. I'm very pleased that COSLA have now set up a kind of subcommittee of their Community Safety Committee looking at culture and sport, because previously Harry McGuigan, who is a very good champion of arts and culture, had to convene a body which covered police, which covered housing, which covered lots of different areas. So the chance for culture to really raise its head was very difficult. I think that's a very good opportunity and forum for conveners. And remember, at the end of the day, local authorities have responsibility for this. It's not for us. It's for local authorities to decide. But I think it would be very useful for the culture conveners, many of them are newly elected since local government elections in May, to meet and discuss the pros and cons, but also good practice and not so good practice in some of this. But my issue is how do we make sure that the quality of what they're producing can serve the communities they deserve and the artists that they support, but also perhaps what we need to do is a democratic accountability, because you get democratic accountability, economic development, for example, within local authorities. You know, constituents will be the first to complain if their economic development convener isn't doing whatever they're doing. But why is it we think it's okay for arts and culture somehow to be hived off somewhere else? And what's the role? Now, I think there's been very good examples where there's a really good integration between the policy interests of a council, a democratically elected council, and the trust, and frequently you'll have board members that are obviously conveners of the relevant culture committee within local authority. But I think it's, in a sense, I would say it's uncharted territory because we've not examined it, but it actually they've been existing for some time. And I think it's the right time to look at this. So perhaps as part of your deliberations, I don't know how much evidence you're planning to take further, but I would be very interested in seeing that, or even if you had an opportunity to scope what you think should be looked at, if it's something that you're not going to do as in-depth. And perhaps that's something that the committee that Harry McGuigan has set up via COSLA, which myself and Sheila Robinson will co-chair with Culture and Sport, could ask them to look at, if that's something you think is useful.
I asked the question because obviously I think Audit Scotland made the point that cultural trusts have tremendous potential. Obviously, it's not all about the money, but that's part of it, let's be honest. But they also have, in trying to further, I think, the vision that you have for horticultural development, which is very broad and fairly ambitious, and that's very good. But I think for them to take, I mean, they've made some issues about whether there are governance issues. They've made some points about the interaction between the trust and the board and how that interacts with a local authority, etc. I think it would be helpful, Cabinet Secretary, if there was an overarching strategy that obviously is a central government strategy, that we were quite clear about what it is that we're trying to investigate, about how well they do operate. And if there are problems within local authorities in that interaction, then it would be helpful to have some guidance, because I personally am not very well informed about this, and I think that would be helpful just to push that forward, because it is an issue that I think we could get a lot more out of.
I think that's a very interesting proposal. I think there's two things part of this. One of them is one of the issues is to decide what we want to do for culture across Scotland. Remember, and I'm very conscious of this, that the budgets of the local authorities collectively on culture and heritage is bigger than the budget I have on a national basis. So therefore, if we're going to try and make sure that we're doing the best in terms of cultural provision, there needs to be a partnership. So I'm speaking at the Vocal Conference of the policy officials. I've brought together, as I said, the conveners, because what we've been doing over the last period is trying to shape a common vision of what it is that we want and what we would expect. Now then, what we should then do is how we're making sure that all the bodies are serving it. It's one of the things I think from Creative Scotland's point of view, they've done very well with their place partnerships and their Creative Place Awards and their support of working partnership with local authorities. So I think we need to set out what it is that we agree needs to be the vision of what we want to achieve, and then we need to make sure that all the bodies are delivering, and that might also then include where do cultural trusts fit in this and how we can maximise their impact, or indeed when local authorities are making a decision whether to have one or not have one, they're equipped and armed with the experience, good, bad and indifferent from other areas, because in my cursory knowledge I think some work better than others. And in some instances they're required, but in some instances perhaps maybe the access participation agenda for culture is so strong that it's best kept within a local authority as opposed to a cultural trust. But that needs to be a bit more investigated, and I think the leadership that you've taken as a committee in looking at it, or starting to look at that area, I think is very helpful. So I think scoping out the areas that you think need to be looked at as part of your sessions would be very helpful to inform any future work.
Just very briefly, do you have a time scale for that? Because I actually think this issue is not actually too far away from some of the issues in Creative Scotland, that some of the concerns about Creative Scotland have arisen because of a problem over some of the sort of basic vision as to what we're supposed to be doing. Do you have a time scale as to...
In terms of, the going back to the kind of vision of what's required for Creative Scotland, that's in the corporate plan. In terms of the work that we're talking about here, to be fair to COSLA, remember they've just come through the local government elections. Committees, as you know, because of lots of different coalition and agreements and politics and all the rest of it, took some time. So people are now in place. The new conveners are now in place. So the first meeting of bringing together the local government and the Scottish Government in terms of looking at culture has only just been started. We've not had our first meeting of it. I do think it might be helpful if I was informed by this committee and going to that first meeting. I'll let you know when it is. That's an agenda that we think is useful for both of us. I can't give you a time frame, and neither can I commit local government to do this, because it's up to the end of the day. If we respect local government and their independence, we can persuade them that we think this is a common and good agenda. But actually, I think that would be helpful. This is where the committee can help, both locally and nationally, to help, I think, encourage local government to do it, because it also allows them, I think, a better influence on what's happening nationally than perhaps they do just now.
Blair Adams.
Thank you, Convener. Cabinet Secretary, it was really interesting to hear you say that it's more about the money, because when we actually asked the people giving evidence in this area, they all said that despite added value and entrepreneurship and all the community and expert involvement that could come with a trust, that if it wasn't for the tax incentive, local authorities wouldn't do it. That was quite worrying. I think that the model effectively wouldn't stand up on its own without that incentive, although that's not under threat at the moment. But the other concern that came through was the difference in parity in the workforce and changing conditions and how that would affect when it's much more released. So my question, I suppose, is from the professional point of view of librarians and curatorial staff. Has there been any representation to the government about how cultural trusts might affect them in terms of their professional standing?
I've just confirmed with my officials that we're not aware of anything that's come to us from unions or from anywhere else about those issues. But they are important issues whenever you're looking at changes of status. And it's important that you support the staff that are providing, the frontline staff that are providing services. In fact, all staff that are providing services. But it's not something that has come to us. Cultural trusts have not really been an issue that has landed or come to us as as an area of concern, either positively or negatively. But my instinct, I think, as Liz Smith and perhaps yourselves in bringing this to the committee, is that it is something that is worth looking at, because it's such a major part now of the cultural provision in Scotland. If I reiterate that in terms of, and getting back to the budget discussions that we're meant to be having, actually their level of budget is actually bigger than what I can determine in terms of the Scottish budget.
Cabinet Secretary, you say that you haven't, your officials haven't received any concerns about cultural trusts, but we did have evidence from Unison, and I'll quote what they said. Talking about councils setting up cultural trusts, they said, They do it as an efficiency saving. They are tax avoidance schemes to avoid paying VAT and to get relief on non-domestic rates. And as Claire Adamson quite rightly said, when asked whether the councils whether they would set them up if they didn't have this particular financial saving, they said no, they probably wouldn't. Do you have any concerns about the views expressed by Unison in terms of what's happening with cultural trusts?
Well, I do, because I think cultural provision is not just about the money you provide. I've already said that in terms of the cultural bodies that I've got, I've tried to protect I've got responsibility for. I've tried to protect them as much as possible, but it's also about how you and what you do. And I think, therefore, there should be as much time and attention on how and what they do in support of artists and cultural provision in their area as it is about finances. But remember, a lot of this comes down to the relationship between national and local government. A lot of it comes down to the ability and the respect that we have that local authorities can make their own decisions as to whether they set up trusts or not. So I think in taking this forward, it might be something that would be worth, the committee should speak to the local government committee of this parliament, because you know, you can express a view and opinion, but I think it would be perhaps unwise to tell local councils what they should or shouldn't do. I think you can give advice as to what works and doesn't work. You can give, you can report and publish a report as to what you think the successes are, what the challenges are in the debate. But I really think that that really is an issue that you should probably work collectively with local government on. But in terms of Unison's concerns, I think they've had that position on trust generally, and their trust in not just culture areas but other areas of policy. So I think that's what we also have to be mindful. And there is a question which I'm not sure if you've taken evidence on: is the trust model better for culture than other areas that have trusts in local government? And I think that's probably something that's worth benchmarking as to, is there anything that makes it particularly more attractive for culture than it is for something else, or indeed is it just the same, etc. So I mean, I've said that it's not an area that we've been asked to look at or have looked at, but it is one area that I think, in terms of looking forward, we should be. But I'd be very much be interested to be informed by what you're doing. But I think we must do it in association with causeless interests, because otherwise we would be in the situation that national government is dictating to local government, and we've tried very hard over the last few years not to be in that position.
Far be it for me to suggest such a thing, but you mentioned the local government and regeneration committee, and of course the local government committee looked at the issue of trusts in relation to the living wage and published a report in February of this year, where they quite clearly stated that it had been very hard to find answers to the questions as to whether it was possible to build a living wage into agreements into local government contracts, for example. Now, I just wondered whether or not there is a wider issue about cultural trusts and other trusts, for that matter, and in terms of the connection between that and procurement and local government, and the reason why they're being set up, as opposed to being for the benefit of the consumers of those services and users of those services, but it is in fact to do with what Unison has stated, and also what the local government committee found was that the difficulty of actually putting in place the living wage, which is in place for other public sector workers.
Well, it's also a policy that's been pursued by the Scottish Government in its cultural bodies, and that is a challenge. I think we shouldn't underestimate the importance of that kind of social contract that we have in terms of no compulsory redundancies, in terms of what we're doing, in terms of a living wage, but also in terms of despite the pay freezes that have taken place, increases for those the lowest paid in our bodies. And if you look across different portfolios, I think it's in the range of about 60% of the employees in the cultural and heritage bodies actually are amongst the lowest paid within the public sector. A lot of them, whether it's security, whether it's in stewardship, doing really important roles. And I also the chance to put on record, I mean, some of the staff, particularly in Historic Scotland, are not that well paid at all in the but in terms of comparative wages in other sectors, whether it's in health or whether it's in other areas, they are passionate about what they do. They give a great experience to people, and certainly when we visited, the Scottish Cabinet visited in Orkney, I was so impressed with the rangers that I met there and the service they provided. Now, we've managed to do that within the public sector, within the Scottish Government. I'm not as familiar, and I will now look at the report from local government about what they were saying in relation to the living wage, in relation to what local councils are doing, but we have made our commitment very clear as a Scottish Government. But that's the challenges we have, and perhaps there is an issue about trusts where most of the employees are not as highly paid as other sectors when you've got financial pressures at difficult times. But I'm pleased that we've managed to relatively protect as much of the frontline services as we can in terms of the support, in terms of culture in the Scottish Government. But it's not my role to speak for local government. They need to do that themselves.
Thank you very much. Colin Beattie.
Thank you. Cabinet Secretary, as far as I'm aware, there's a possibility that there might be a merger between Historic Scotland and the Royal Commission for Ancient Monuments. Do we have any timeline on that? And is there any feel as to what the initial budget costs might be to affect that?
I have answered in Parliament that we are doing this because it's the right thing to do in policy terms, and it's like quite an interesting statement to me, reflecting the discussion we've just had. We're not doing this because the key driver is financial. The key driver is that we think a better service can be provided, and we think it would be in the long-term interest of both organisations if they merge into one that's new. The business case for that is currently being developed. It has not been approved yet, so and I'm expecting that, I think, in round about the end of the year, beginning of 2013, that kind of time frame. The chief executives of both organisations are working jointly on this and reporting jointly to me. I'm very pleased with the progress of the work so far and the relationships that are being built and developed about how they can provide an improved service so that it's not a budgetary driver. What I can say is the only organisation not to receive any cuts. Now, bear in mind, you've probably had sessions with Mike Russell earlier on, and you've seen some of the pressures that because of the Westminster settlement that we're having in lots of different areas. RCAMS is the only body that's getting a flat line. It's got no cuts whatsoever, and part of that is to protect it at difficult times.
Cabinet Secretary, can I thank you very much on behalf of the committee for coming along this morning and giving your evidence, and I will suspend briefly to allow witnesses to leave. Moving on to agenda item 2 on this morning's agenda. The purpose of this item is to discuss the evidence we have heard on the draft budget before we consider our draft report at a future meeting. Can I ask members to be short and as they can? We've got to try and help the clerks in assisting to draft our report. So constructive comments would be appreciated. Liz Smith.
Convener, thank you. Obviously, because of the constraints this morning and timescale, we've obviously missed out quite a number of key questions. And I do think, given that part of the important budget areas is higher education, and because of time, we simply didn't get round to that today. Would it be possible for us to write to the Cabinet Secretary? He did actually almost volunteer to provide more information.
Tell me
because I think, you know, some of the questions that were on the clerk's briefing were very important, and as I say, just time got in the way, so we couldn't do that. And I think I wouldn't like to think that as a committee we hadn't scrutinised some of the higher education stuff before we.
I think that's absolutely correct.
Right?
I'll make sure that the letter that goes to the Cabinet Secretary certainly covers the higher education area, including the sort of suggested areas of possible questioning that were prepared in the paper. But also there were one or two other areas that we didn't cover as well across the portfolio, and I'll make sure that those are included. If members want to add any suggestions now, I'm more than happy to
I'll give you a
take
couple,
them. Either this morning on the record or even by email to myself or the clerks.
Okay, do that.
Neil Finlay.
No, I think just to say, if we can ask him to address the big issues across the portfolio, then that'd be fine. In terms of what was said this morning, I was just wondering whether we can put the comments that were made by the Cabinet Secretary in relation to budget and you know, student numbers and all the stuff that there was disagreement about, or apparent disagreement, if we can have some maybe correspond with people like Spice, with Audit Scotland and Scotland's colleges on those issues, to see whether we can come to some common ground or whether we continue to have major division on it.
Just to clarify, I mean, we certainly will be able to put both sides of the argument into the report and come to our own views and conclusion on that. We have got very little time to enter any detailed correspondence with the bodies, but we have got their evidence both in oral session and in writing, which we can summarise in the report.
Is it possible that we could seek to do that via email, just ask them to comment?
Well, we can ask them to comment. We will ask them to comment if that's helpful.
Yeah. And you know, obviously with the college unions as well being expressed
we'll
in different. Yeah, that'd be great. Yeah, people who gave us evidence.
Everybody who gave evidence. Okay.
Thank you.
Okay. Any other comments from members? Liam?
Yeah, just to add in, I think the Cabinet Secretary offered to come back with some more detail around the Transformation Fund and how that was being disbursed. So, I mean, hopefully we'll get that in reasonably short order. It would be also helpful, I mean, I raised it with them, the issue of the funding to incentivise widening access. I think he put a lot of that into the legislation, but even a view as to how that he would expect that carrot, if you will, to work would be helpful. I think in terms of the broader themes, I suspect we're not going to come to an agreement in relation to the transparency, and I think that probably just needs to be expressed in the report. I don't doubt that the Cabinet Secretary did as much as he could to try and answer the questions, but just as opposition parties were being accused of taking their own view on the figures, so the Cabinet Secretary, I think, was expressing the figures in a way that suited his ends as well, and that's entirely legitimate. But I think we've seen and heard enough evidence through this process that some fairly well qualified people were struggling to get a handle on the detail. I have to say, I think in terms of the regionalisation fund, the expectations of the Funding Council and I suppose the ministers of the release of those savings in the time frame suggested is questionable. I appreciate the Cabinet Secretary takes a different view, but I think those are probably very ambitious expectations in terms of the return. And I think in terms of the cut to the teaching grant, I think there are issues around the quality of the provision that can be delivered as a result of that. Again, there may be disagreement in the committee, but I would certainly be keen that our report acknowledges the risk in relation to quality of course provision as a result.
I think I think obviously that we will have a discussion about the report and what it does and does not contain, but clearly I think there is a case to include in the report some questions around the complexity of the budget, and particularly in relation to colleges. It is complex, it is difficult, and I think it's not unreasonable that we could certainly, I think, at least raise some questions about that. But I'm sure we'll have that discussion.
Saying that seemed to be more of an issue this year than last year. I mean, I think last year it may well have been that the focus was on some fairly dramatic changes in the College budget, and therefore that's what that we were individually and collectively as a committee being pressed on. But it does appear, if anything, that the issues around complexity are going in the wrong direction rather than being tidied up.
We'll have discussion. Do the members want to raise any other points at this stage in terms of assisting the clerks? Any other issues that have to be, or they would like to be discussed in terms of the report? Okay, can I move on to agenda item 3? The third item is whether to consider our draft report to the Finance Committee on the draft budget in private at future meetings. Are members agreed? Thank you. And agenda item 4, our final decision is whether to consider our work programme in private at next week's meeting. We will be discussing possible witnesses, and the outcomes will of course be published on the web. Are members agreed? Agreed. Thank you very much. Can I close the meeting?